presentation this morning. I'm happy that apparently everybody made its way here. Germany is hit by a lot of strikes, but I suppose that most of you did not between the strike of the trains and the strike of the aircrafts that helped you. Some of our colleagues who are due to come back to Brussels to start their working week will be stuck somewhere, and we expect them as of Wednesday. Bavaria is very happy to host this important event. Media politics are of utmost importance for us. In the German system of competences, it's not the federal government which is responsible for that area. The German Länder are taking care of it, and Bavaria is representing all German Länder in the Council of Europe when it comes to media politics. Given that, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to the European Audiovisual Observatory, to you, Director Nikochev, for the initiative to come here with today's workshop, and to Alison Hindhaff for the excellent cooperation in preparing it. I just referred to the competences of the German Länder for media politics. However, as some of you know, the German system of competences is more complicated than that. Tax issues fall within the federal competences, and so does the issue of your debate today. But at the same time, decisions of our federal government, like fiscal incentive schemes for film industry, are very relevant for us, since Bavaria is among the most important locations for film productions in Germany. That is why we are also carefully observing the ongoing negotiations about TTIP, and notably its scope of application. And we insist on the exclusion of media from the negotiation mandate to be seen in a broad perspective. If the promotion of audiovisual production is not part of the negotiations, that means, in our view, that also fiscal incentives are not part of the negotiations. But now I'm handing the floor to you, Ms. Nikochev, and I wish you well for today's discussion. Thank you very much.
Lieber Herr Wiegand, dear friends of the observatory, if I may say so, first of all, thank you for all being here, despite the problems that were already mentioned. And a special thanks on our side for really to the Bavarian hosts. It has been a great pleasure to organize this meeting. We do that quite often. I don't think we have ever had such an easy task. So I recommend this to all of you who might have an interest, even so that might mean that in the future, if we were to come back, we might not get a spot. But thank you, sincere thanks. Now, even though I say, I believe that most of you know the observatory, I still feel it might be good if I say a couple of words as to who we are and what we do. Now, the observatory is a part of the Council of Europe, and it's based in Strasbourg, which is why also one of our colleagues cannot be here at the moment. It's difficult to travel. But if you find the time to travel, come and see us. Now we have 41 members at the observatory, and that means almost all of the states in Europe, plus the European Union, plus, since this year, Morocco. What's our task? Our task is to help enhance transparency of the audiovisual sector in Europe, and that we do by collecting data and information on the legal framework of the sector and its markets, as well as on sources for financing the sector. The way we do that is under one very, very strict premise, and that is that we'll be neutral. Neutral, no policy making, and really strictly down to collecting facts and information. Now, what sort of information can you therefore obtain from the observatory? I can give you only some examples. The list is much longer. Now, we draw a detailed picture of the television, on-demand and film markets in our yearbook. We inform you about the latest relevant laws through our legal newsletter Iris. You can also find lots of explanation in our publications of the EU regulatory and policy framework, that of the Council of Europe as well. We offer data of box offices, success of films via our Lumiere database. And to get already a bit closer to the topic of today, we also inform you about national direct funding mechanisms through our Corda database and other in-depth reports. And I could continue that list. Now, then to really fit this into the context of today, why this conference? Now, fiscal incentives are a major source for the financing of the sector, and therefore, naturally, a topic on which we should provide information. Now, this conference, I have to say, is our first major step in doing so more regularly in the future. It is at the same time our first event here in Brussels, and the plan is really to be back next year with another interesting topic. So you may already know that for fall of next year. Now, the study on which we focus today has been made possible thanks to a donation from the Ministry of Education and Culture of Finland. I'm very pleased, therefore, to give a special welcome to Lena Laaksonen, sitting here in front, who represents Finland on the Observatory's governing board and is the Counselor for Cultural Affairs and Acting Director of the Ministry. Thank you, Lena, and thank you, Finland. Now, what did we do with the money? We used the donation to commission an impact analysis of fiscal incentive schemes intended to support film and audiovisual production in Europe. And today you will hear the preliminary results. The full report, including translations into German and French, will be available by the end of the year. The translations may be at the beginning of next year, depending on how quickly translators can work and how quickly we can control what they did. Now, a word on how we launched the study. We followed the procedures of the Council of Europe. We launched a tender, and it was won by Olsberg SPI, which is one of Europe's most experienced screen sector management consultancies with clients in the public and private sectors. Now, Jonathan, if I may permit myself to say so, the head of this consultancy has had a career first as a merchant banker in London and New York, has been in the film industry for more than 32 years in a variety of roles, producer, distributor, sales agent, management consultant, and you will hear more of him and his colleague, Andre Barnes, who is also with us later in the day. Now, we did really enjoy working with Jonathan and his team and are looking forward to what they have to present. And before I let them do so, I would like still to stress what the role of the observatory was in the shaping of the study. We did really discuss, of course, and gave our parameters for the scope. We have tried to give advice as much as we could along the process. We supplied additional information and also contacts, and we gave regular feedbacks on the project at various stages. But what you also should know is what we have not done. We did not dictate how they should conduct the study. And we also did not and we will not interfere with the findings of the study. This, in our view, is the responsibility of the consultants. And any conclusions that are to be drawn by them or by you, by the people who use the information, be it from today or in the report. The observatory will not interfere here. We don't tell anybody what to do or not to do because of our strict commitment to neutrality. There's one exception to this rule that we won't interfere. We will interfere in pointing out where it's really at the core of our mission, where it's about transparency. And I think one thing that the study revealed is that there is still a lot of work to be done for us, maybe for others, to achieve a greater transparency when it comes to fiscal incentives, how they work, what impact they have, and, well, if we can help to further elaborate that, we will certainly do. Now, I also think you need to know a little bit more about the brief that we gave to Jonathan, as to what he should not cover, because that's what you will not hear now in his study. So we told him to leave out all the main measures for film public policy in support of film production and distribution, all the others. And on the European level, we would count as such support to European co-productions, Euromarsch, for example, support to European circulation, media, promotion of European works, the Audiovisual Media Service Directive. And on the national level, there are, in addition to fiscal incentives, direct funding, being state and territorial budgets, lottery, or levy on revenues of broadcasters and distributors to finance national film funds, mandatory investments in production by broadcasters and distributors, co-production policies. So this is all what you will not hear. The report to come, and now also the presentation to come, is really focusing only on tax shelter, tax credit, and rebates. The roundtable that will follow that discussion might then also go a bit wider as putting it into the context, but this will be the duty of my dear colleague André Lange, who will moderate the panel. Now, for all the other issues that I mentioned are also important to financing production, you might have a look at our website. Now, last but not least, I was asked to give you some rules as to the housekeeping. For those of you who are fans of tweeting, you can do so if you use the line that I will not really read because it looks very strange. If you manage to hook up to the Wi-Fi network as e-user with the right password, which is Bavaria. That being said, I'm happy to hand over to Jonathan.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you to the Observatory for the opportunity for Andrew Barnes and I to be here today to give you the findings of our study. And thank you also to the representation of the Free State of Bavaria to the EU for letting us have this terrific facility. I've spoken around Europe several times in meetings like this, and I think this now sets the gold standard for how this needs to be organised and presented in the future. So, what are we going to do? Andrew and I are going to spend about 40 minutes going through the results, the findings of the study that we've undertaken. And essentially, after this introduction, there are five elements to what we're presenting to our findings. We're going to talk a little bit about the categories of fiscal incentives that we've looked into, because they've got some interesting elements amongst them. We're then going to identify some of the trends that we've noticed in recent years as to what's going on. It's a very active sector, as you all know, and so spotting what's happening and trying to determine what might happen in the future is part of our work. We're going to look specifically at the economic impacts of the incentives that we're studying. Having done that, we're going to sit back a little and think of, well, if we've now looked at what the categories and the trends are and the economic impacts are, what do we make of all of this? So we'll talk about some perspectives that we have on the sort of the landscape of incentives around Europe, and then we're going to play back to you our sort of final conclusions. So that's what we'll be doing today. Okay, we're summarising the findings of the study so far. There's a little bit more time to go, so if anybody has any thoughts or comments, wants to spend time with us later today or communicate with us over the next week or so, we're still open to business as you were, but we don't expect much to change. So let's talk about what we mean by fiscal incentives. These are national measures, and the amount of support and the way in which support is provided, generally speaking, is based on two different ways to go. One is the amount of qualifying production expenditures of the relevant project, or alternatively, looking not at the project necessarily initially, looking at the investors who are coming into a project, the amount and the way in which their investment is structured, which determines the amount of support. So just to repeat what Suzanne said earlier, we are not addressing national or regional, discretionary or selective funding in this particular study. Although most of the schemes we looked at cover both film and television production, and indeed in some cases, as we'll describe, a couple of other areas, most of the data we were able to get from the countries that we studied, and we'll explain who they are later, which they are, most of the data was about their feature film schemes. But we did look at the impact of these incentives on film and also on television when we could. Something to say, which will be a theme throughout our presentation, is that, as you would expect, and certainly as the observatory knows, the quantitative data that we were seeking was not always fully complete or up to date. It wasn't presented necessarily in the same way country by country. So the comparisons were a bit of a challenge. We spent a lot of time working with the countries that we studied, who were very, very helpful, and we thank them all for their cooperation. So we spent a lot of time looking at data, going back to our sources, excuse me, making sure it was complete, that we were interpreting it in the right way. But as a consequence of this, and I think you can imagine if you're looking to try and get data from all of Europe that was the same from country to country, you can imagine the challenge. As a consequence of this, our research methodology always had as a very important element of it qualitative research. So that involved not just literature reviews, desk research on whatever we could find from reports from the countries concerned and elsewhere, but also a substantial number of individual interviews, confidential consultations, as we call them, with key professionals and players around Europe and in the countries that we were studying. And in some cases, we were very grateful that our consultees were willing to talk to us on several occasions. I mean, we probably so far conducted over 80 consultations at this point, and we probably have a few more to go. Okay, I'm going to talk now, just to dig a little bit deeper into the categorization of the fiscal incentives that we studied. And there are three categories. We call them tax shelters, rebates, and tax credits. And let me try and be clear as to what the differences are. Tax shelters. These are the sort of incentives that is where Europe started, if you like. These are structures that essentially invite tax-paying individuals or companies, usually with substantial tax liabilities, to invest in production, qualifying production, and if they were to invest in production, they get attractive write-offs, essentially deductions against those tax liabilities. As such, these schemes, it's interesting, it's quite hard to identify in countries that have these schemes or have had these schemes exactly how much from a national budget, for example, is being, how much money is supporting production in this way. Also, although initially the national treasury concern is losing revenue because they're sheltering the liabilities, there is sort of downstream taxable occurrences that the treasury will get back some of the money if the investors get profits, they're taxed on those profits, and also the activity that's generated in production yields tax returns. So you can measure a cost-benefit analysis, but one of the advantages of this system, in some cases to governments, has been you can't always tell what it's costing a nation. So it's less than the 100% transparency you get in the next two. Rebates, the second of these systems, much simpler, essentially constructed in a way that there are a set of rules and regulations that a qualifying production must adhere to in order to identify the amount of qualifying expenditure on which the rebate, which is essentially a percentage, expressed as a percentage of that amount, comes back to the production company. I suppose one would say this is a trend one would see more and more of this sort of simpler style of rebate. It is, however, quite obvious in a budget of a national ministry, often the Ministry of Culture, what the amount of money being spent each year is, and in some cases there are caps or maximum amounts in any year which are available, which can create some problems. The third category that we've identified, tax credits, are essentially very, very similar to rebates, but the way in which the producer actually gets access to the rebate is through their annual tax return. As a consequence, if a company that is seeking to get the rebate through this measure has substantial tax liabilities, they will not get the full benefit of the rebate because one is set against the other. Okay, just to identify some of the countries in Europe that have the most active structures. I mean, this isn't a complete list, but these, we see these as countries that one could have studied, and it's quite interesting that Lithuania, a recent entity, has decided to go this route. In the case of France and the Soficas, they've been around probably longer than any other structure, and as you'll be seeing in our presentation, France has a very sophisticated system of support measures of this type, of which one is the Sofica. The countries that currently are operating rebates are shown here, and again, countries that have recently become involved, like Croatia, has decided to go this route. And Netherlands, which has recently recreated an incentive, used to have, I think I'm right in saying, a tax shelter many years ago, stopped it, and now has come back with a more sort of typical rebate structure. And the tax credit that I mentioned before, again, France has had a very substantial, which my colleague Andrew will describe in a while, a series of support mechanisms along these lines that work very, very well. Italy, in its grouping of different types of structures, also has in the UK moved away in 2006-07 from a tax shelter structure to a tax credit structure with substantial success. Okay, let's talk about some trends. First of all, there's a lot of activity. Many countries around Europe have introduced, or several countries have introduced new incentives, and several of the countries that have existing incentives have adapted or modernized or updated what they already have. So some examples here of where incentives already exist or have been recently introduced. Within the last year or so, all of these countries have introduced new measures. Do you want to just mention what's happened in Serbia?
Yeah, so Serbia previously had an incentive between 2011 and 2012 as a single-year trial, and they have recently suggested they will reintroduce this, but it was previously removed because of the lack of broader support around the industry. They required some legal changes to really maximise the impact, which
So we thought it was interesting to look at Serbia because these sorts of fiscal incentives are not, they're not that obvious how they work. When they're introduced in some countries, they're not always introduced with great clarity. And in some countries, even after introduction, it's not certain as to what the results are and what the movement is. So I think later on in our panel, we might talk about how we can improve the data and communications aspects of the incentives work. Very interesting at the moment that one region in Europe that hasn't had incentives is the Nordic countries, except for Iceland, I have to say. And there seems to be at the moment a lot of discussion within several of the countries about introducing an incentive. In many of these countries, they're Their film agreement is being renegotiated. These are sort of support agreements that last for several years. And in Sweden, for example, and Finland, this negotiation about film agreements is incentives is a key aspect of it. And also in Norway, I think I'm right in saying that there was talk about an incentive several years ago, and one was announced, and it didn't happen. And we can talk about later on about why not, but essentially it was my take on it is it didn't happen because it wasn't made clear to the production community what the advantages would be. Now Norway is once more having a look at it again. I mentioned earlier that some schemes coming from ministries' budgets have limitations or caps which restrict the amount of funding available, but in some countries like the Czech Republic, for example, and others, these caps are being increased. We haven't seen any instant of a cap being decreased, I think it's fair to say. And indeed, adjustments have been made, for example, in Ireland, where the proportion of the percentage, if you like, of the expenditure, qualifying expenditure, is being increased. And in the UK and in Italy in recent years, the schemes have been expanded from feature films to cover television, and indeed in the UK, animation and video games. A movement away from the tax shelter model. Why is this the case? It's, as I said earlier, the tax shelter structure is complicated. It's between the money coming from the investor landing in the production funding account. There are several steps that have to be taken. Several entities like certainly lawyers, accountants, bankers, and in general the feeling has been with most of these systems that they're not sufficiently transparent, and I'm not addressing any particular nation's structure right now, but transparency has been hard, and it's been regarded as actually being quite expensive because of all these deductions that happen along the way. Do you want to talk about Belgium for a moment?
I think so. The Belgian Federal Parliament has recently adopted various reforms. So far as we're aware, when we've last spoken to people in the Belgian community, those are in discussion with the European Commission for state aid certification. They're expecting those to be finalised for next year.
But the Belgian system has been one of the most impressive and successful, and I think we'll show some information about that a little bit later on. But next door in Luxembourg, their tax shelter incentive structure has recently been closed. We are not informed as to why, to be honest. We've tried to find out. There's even some confusion. There are some sort of national film support film industry websites that still claim the incentive is still there, but our information is that it's been closed, and it's going to be replaced with more direct funding, as far as we understand. So that's kind of interesting. From a producer's perspective, they have, in some cases, complained or commented that managing the relationship and communications with investors and all these entities, the banks, the lawyers, the accountants, is, compared to a rebate or a tax credit structure, very time-consuming and can cause delays, which for them is a problem. However, a tax shelter has one very substantial advantage, and that it does provide the cash from the incentive during the production process. Most of the other structures, by and large, rebate or return money spent after the production has been completed or after an accountant's certificate has been supplied. Although there are some systems that, even if they are rebates or tax credits, that do have a process for providing interim certificates from the competent authority that does provide the producer an opportunity to get some cash flow.
Yeah, Ireland's an interesting example of this. Within the framework of the new tax rebate structure that they're adopting, they will be allowed up to 90% money up front, providing the productions meet certain criteria that I think they're just finalising at the moment.
So you can see there is no one-size-fits-all system, and That's not a surprise, obviously, because all these countries are very different. But if you like, the technology behind structuring incentives is changing and developing all the time, which makes it a very, very interesting area to look at. Okay, one of the concerns that we have found is that in countries that are thinking about new incentive structures, some producers in some countries are worried that the additional money made available for the incentive will actually be deducted from other sources of support, such as discretionary funding. And again, back to Norway, this was one of the reasons why the first time Norway tried to put an incentive in place, it wasn't enacted. The reality is, we've looked around for evidence that such cuts normally follow when an incentive is introduced or improved, and it's very, very hard to find. Possibly Italy's an example.
Yeah, Italy, there has been some evidence that direct funding and discretionary funding has been cut, but it's very difficult to unknit that from the broader governmental challenges and fiscal challenges the country is facing. Overall, the investment in the industry has gone up, and that obviously reflects the importance the Italian government sort of states for the industry.
Okay. Something to mention about the rebate-style incentives that, again, is not necessarily always recognised. And this applies to a country that perhaps can create additional production activity as a result of the incentive being in place. Because of the timing of the repayment of the rebate, usually being after the production expenditure has incurred, for additional activity, the tax yield and the multiplier economic yield to the Treasury of having the additional new production is often sufficient to actually fund the rebate when it occurs many months later. So in some cases, these new schemes, or indeed existing schemes if they're improved, can be considered to be self-financing. So when there are concerns that within a government that, well, we're making this money available for a new incentive and that's going to drain the coffers of the Treasury, it's not necessarily at all always the case because of this sort of timing of the cash flows. However, there is no doubt that in some territories, some countries that have particularly high costs of production and have no incentive, Norway, Finland, Sweden, we're looking at you in this regard. There's definite exposure to lower cost neighbours in the Baltic territories. We've got lots of examples of this that do have incentives. So lower cost and an incentive against higher cost, no incentive, is a very difficult market in which to operate. Okay, Andrew.
Okay, so if we move on to how we did the economic impact study. The methodology we used was something called difference in differences. We looked at a baseline of countries which had incentives, particularly useful those which have changed or improved them over the period, although there are limited numbers of those with enough data. And we compared those against countries which didn't. You can create a baseline of production spend, production trends within Europe, and look at what the impact of the incentive is as part of this. This gives us a way of looking at it in broader than just a single country. Obviously, there's a lot of factors which affect production spend. The needs of particular script being the smallest one of them. You know, people aren't going to shoot Lawrence of Arabia in Switzerland. And there's a lot of things around that which have been adjusted using qualitative data into the econometric analysis that we've undertaken. We looked at a sample of production country support systems based on whether or not they had a fiscal incentive system, the depth and comparability of available data, which is a key challenge, where everyone looks at their systems very differently depending on national preferences. We have to be able to get everything into a position where the data are comparable. And as a result, we came up with this list of countries. A few comments, obviously in France, in Italy, in the United Kingdom, in various countries, there's multiple bits of legislation that underpin the different incentive systems. There are 4 different crédits d'impôt in France. there are 4 different tax relief structures in the UK which underpin it, but for the purpose of simplicity we've just done it in this regard. There's also a lot more legislation dates than we perhaps noted on here. These are the major ones where they've gone back to the Commission for the purposes of recertification, which are obviously the major sort of dates that we're looking at. And we've compared them to a number of countries which don't have incentives. We came down to these 3 in the end based on the availability and depth of data, which allow us to look at broader scale production trends within the European space. This is a graph that we borrowed from the CNC's recent report, which was very useful, showing the amount of annual investment through the tax shelter. It's in millions of euros. There's no inflation adjustment, but it does show that there's a really strong trend in the amount that is going in through the tax shelter, both in loans and in equity, since 2003. There's a really strong, steady and consistent growth in the amount that goes through Belgian productions. Croatia is obviously an interesting country, one of the recent joiners to the European fiscal incentive landscape, and it gives us some really useful data on the effect. And if we look at where we were before the incentive, the red line, and since the launch of the incentive is the little orange line, and if we sort of continued it for 2014, it would be somewhere up there. It keeps going up. Sandy can talk about more about that when we go through the panel. But also if you look at the level of discretionary funding, that stayed relatively in the same range. There is no project which has received both to date, and there's a lot of new production activity and a lot of extra investment coming into the industry as a result of the introduction of the rebate. Capacity utilisation is a really important measure of this. When we look at the data, what we can see is that the introduction of incentive frequently has a really immediate catalytic impact on the scale. Capacity that is unused or that is perhaps a bit redundant where there is no incentive, where it's based on selective funding or private funding, gets very quickly used up, and capacity that is easily created, people coming from other comparable sectors, TV production, or sort of national level TV production, theatre, move into the sector and are able to sort of upskill and invest. The result is that the state reaches its capacity utilisation in a much shorter period of time than would be the case if just private investment, if just the status quo continued. And where the incentive continues for a long period, that sustains the growth, it underpins it, and it builds confidence for further investment in the industry. We can see in multiple countries that investment in facilities is very much underpinned, if you speak to people, by their knowledge that an incentive is there and is going to stick around for a while in an unchanged form. So as a result, the incentives help to underpin the essential investment in skills and infrastructure capacity, delivering a long-term sectoral health, so that even where a lot of the incentive is used for investment production, for portable productions coming from overseas, the underpinning of the skills and the infrastructure capacity that is generated is incredibly useful for the local industry. And if we look at the growth that we can see in 3 countries, we've got the Croatia here again, and we've got the UK in blue, which is almost doubled since the introduction of the current tax relief in 2007. France is on a slightly steadier track, but obviously, as we know, France has got a lot more incentives, and this is the introduction of the Crédit d'Emploi International, the TRIP. But overall, what we can see is if we compare countries with an incentive to countries without, and the graph was unfortunately far too complicated to put up here, then the track for countries with an incentive is very immediate and very quick upwards. If we look at the data of countries with and without incentives, there's also significantly higher production activities in those countries. There's obviously a variety of factors within this, as we've mentioned earlier, the needs of the script, the needs of the creative side of the film, of drive the initial decision to move to a particular location. But the incentives are a major contributing factor. And if we look at countries with incentives in blue against the countries that we've chosen without incentives, the percentage of GDP, the percentage of the economy to which the film industry and TV industry contributes is much higher, particularly in countries like Hungary, the UK and Belgium, with long-term, stable incentive structures which are very predictable and understandable for producers coming in. Sector growth is also strongest in countries with incentives, or, and this is also very important, where selective funding was increased. If we look at the graph, Croatia is a bit of an anomaly because of the time scale. If we did this again for next year, it would be above the line and would have positive growth. These same countries, the UK, Hungary and Belgium, have the strongest growth over the period. Poland increased its selective funding, so that's put it up there. The Netherlands is a slightly unusual case. There's been a lot of increased private sector funding and broadcaster funding of films, largely from speaking to people on account of the fact that box office for local productions has increased quite markedly in recent years, and that's sort of helped drive more investment in. Finland, as we talked about, countries which unfortunately are faced with neighbours with lower cost bases and incentives, has seen quite a precipitous drop in the last 4 years. The countries, not everyone publishes the fiscal benefits of this incentive, which is slightly unfortunate, but those that do show large positive impacts. These are a selection of published ones, and if we look at the recent report for France, for every euro of investment that comes into the country, you get 12.8 euros of investment in the sector and 3.5 euros of tax. That's from the CNC's recent reports. Hungary and Ireland both show positives, so 24.2% more tax paid than was deferred through the tax shelter. And for Ireland, the Department of Finance's cost-benefit model puts the net tax benefits at 21.1 million euros. The UK has similar figures to France, 12 British pounds in additional GVA, that's sectoral equivalent of GDP, generated for every pound of tax relief spent. Back to Jordan.
Andrea, I think we're going to run over time a little bit, but you can give me the old stop signal when we do. Okay. Right. In many countries, measuring levels of employment is a very helpful and potent indicator of success. But unfortunately, although many countries do track employment, there's rarely a clear and consistent methodology used to quantify new jobs created, either full-time or full-time equivalents. It's interesting that some of the incentive schemes that we've studied require and mandate that any production which seeks to benefit from the use of the scheme must supply employment data, and certainly that's been very, very helpful. But our qualitative investigations shows unequivocally that strong incentive structures, when they're introduced and when they're supported and are confidently maintained, they do drive a solid increase in crew numbers. There's a lag between the introduction of an incentive and that crew growing, and we'll come on to that in a while. But there are examples of countries where we've seen this, and just because a country isn't mentioned, it doesn't mean to say that that this is not the case. The report that will be commented on later, I think, has some excellent data about this, as has got a recent report from Deloitte about Belgium. This is a very interesting factor, and I think it's totally understandable, but adjacent nations or film sectors and countries that are close or next to each other, there's strong evidence of a mobility of labour across the border. So we'll show this a bit later with regard to Czech Republic and Hungary. It's definitely been the case for a while with France and Belgium, or UK and Ireland. The whole co-production system helps this, of course. There's no doubt, however, that fluctuations in incentives, and we'll study this again between the Czech Republic and Hungary, does affect job opportunities, which causes the mobility of labour. The UK, which has had an incentive structure for quite a long time, has seen much greater stability in its crew numbers. And indeed, even in recent years, there's been substantial, considerable strength in growth. Right. Obviously, data year on year will change and will be different for a variety of reasons in all the countries that we studied. However, I think it's true to say that Hungary and the Czech Republic, of all the markets that we studied, tend to almost operate as a single labour market, but also approaching being a single market with other issues or other elements, such as facilities, equipment supply, even financiers producers that work across both. And this graph shows, where's that smart pen? Here it is. So, this shows how there's the trend in growth of sector spending, which is production expenditure, I think, that we've studied. There's a very even sort of collaborative growth structure, particularly since 2011, which I think if we analyse some other countries as well, we would probably see repeated. Infrastructure investment, we think, is a very important theme to our study. We've already talked about how the introduction or improvement of an incentive has an almost immediate catalytic effect on sucking up whatever available capacity might exist. So that obviously includes crew and film workers or screen workers, but it also applies to the infrastructure, the supply of facilities and equipment and what have you. And our qualitative research has shown that over a period of time, very substantial investment has followed successful schemes. And I think Hungary, we've noticed, not just the Porter studios, but since the Hungarian incentive was introduced and has been successful, there have been lots of discussion and thoughts about studio expansion. But in the UK in particular, the stability of the tax reform has led to very substantial private sector investment in studios and other facilities, over 500,000 since 2007, we are told. Another challenge for us in terms of data is figuring out how much of the increased activity comes from foreign investment, both outside of the country concerned, but outside of Europe. And this is an area where we would like to suggest in the future, it is one of the areas where some more work is done in terms of transparency and what have you. However, our consultations were very helpful in helping us get a sense of what was happening. And much of the growth, if not most of the growth that we've seen in production activity has come from outside of the nation concerned and mostly outside of Europe. So what's been happening with all of this increased activity is, particularly if the support mechanism, incentives, is regarded as being stable and can be there for a while, creates confidence, capacity is immediately used up, and then eventually planning for more capacity and crew improvement takes place. So what does this mean for the local independent producer that's not involved necessarily in the international portable production business? Well, there are advantages. Obviously, the fact that the overall sector infrastructure and crew standards are increasing will help independent producers when they're able to and when they do use those facilities. And I think, if you move on, this is something that we noticed in that. Remember that the Hungary-Czech Republic slide that we showed before, the Croatia slide? There's lots of evidence in those countries, both experiencing relatively recent incentives, that this is a factor. But also, the independent producers in other countries which have had incentives for a while, UK, Belgium, Ireland, etc., have noticed this. What's been happening is, in addition to their established business of independent production, development and production, many producers have taken advantage of this increased business to get involved in or expand their existing activities in service production. And also in countries, we've noticed, that have introduced television drama as part of the support mechanism for the tax relief, we've noticed feature film producers also now working very successfully in the television drama area. And you know, in general, it's enabled these companies to expand their overall corporate activity, which underpins their sort of corporate strength, if you like. Now, we were asked to look at production flow and dig deeper into, you know, what's happening with the movement of productions. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there are no specific data on a consistent basis available for this. We have looked at some published reports that in some countries that have been helpful. And the Netherlands in particular was interesting. They closed in 2007, they closed their incentive system. The producers in the local market became very, very dependent on selective funding. There was a drop in production volumes. Suppliers of facilities were moving abroad, including to Belgium. And you know, when the Belgian incentive was improved and increased, that had an immediate impact also on what was happening. There were also concerns about the efficiency and the transparency of the Dutch tax shelter as well. However, the one bit of good news is the broadcasters, as Andrew mentioned earlier, and the private sector investment has increased recently. Just moving on again to Czech Republic, in 2010, Czech Republic introduced its own incentive. The Hungarian one had been around for a while, and it rebalanced the system. Again, one sort of single labour market, possibly a single market in other aspects as well. Our research shows that the flow of production is predominantly into Europe, and this is particularly the case for France, Ireland, UK, also less so, but importantly, for Hungary and Czech Republic. Many of these are US originated productions, or other European, US, European unofficial productions. The UK obviously has shown great strength in terms of these international portable or inward investment films, over 70% of total production expenditure in 2013. Ireland, for a similar figure, over 58% during that period of 2005 to 11. And in France, foreign financing, as it's called, and we can talk later or learn more about what that means, is at nearly 22%. But the CNC, in its report of last week, identifies a number of positive impacts, including repatriating to France French-based productions, French-initiated productions that were going elsewhere for more attractive opportunities. Okay. We've noticed that even if two countries next to each other aren't necessarily operating as a single-ish market, there are lots of new relationships emerging where countries that have never worked together are now doing so. And that can be very helpful for the smaller countries with the less mature sectors. And obviously, in addition to the economic benefits, there are substantial cultural, creative, and other benefits to that. But again, the data that we were able to gather does not reveal the full scale of this activity. Okay. It's true to say that in some countries where the incentives aren't working as smoothly as they should, there are adjustments that need to be made on a pretty consistent basis to what is on offer. I think France has been particularly strong in doing that. Right. Going to pull this together, and thank you for your patience, we've run over a bit, in what do we conclude from all of this? And although I'll be repeating some things that we've been saying, I think it's important to try and draw this together. Let's just pull all of that up. one of the major conclusions from this study is not something we were thinking we would come up with when we started, but that is a substantial inconsistency in amount, comparability and quality of shared data. And I would say that the observatory has quite a challenge ahead of it to find ways to encourage the generation of the kind of data that we're talking about. And it's not just about levels of production, amounts of production, where it came from. I think if there was one metric, it would be great to be able to gather. It would be, at any point in time, to what degree is a country's capacity being utilised. If incentives have a great effect on capacity utilisation, then it would be good to know the before and after, for example. Okay. The biggest finding, I think, from our study is this immediate impact on capacity utilisation. There are various examples of that that are shown there. I would say that having an incentive structure that is planned in a way that sits alongside a strategy for facilities growth and infrastructure growth and crew growth is essential. And that's something we haven't seen that much of. The good news about an incentive, once it is established, in most cases, if it's successful, it's known that it's successful, and it gives confidence for years to come for further investment in infrastructure, which, as I say, mostly comes from the private sector. I mean, that 500 million pounds that I mentioned earlier all comes from the private sector, and much of it from outside of Europe. It takes longer to build crew capacity, and I would say that this is one of the big challenges for nations that are thinking about an incentive. To what degree, at the same time as we're putting our incentive in place, should we be taking immediate action now to deal with increasing our crew capacity? And if it doesn't happen fast enough, which one would expect to be the case because it takes a while, then what tends to happen is cost advantages start to disappear, and there is pressure on costs. It's pure economics. Until that supply of crew catches up, we're going to have issues about net cost after the incentive. And in some cases, I'm guessing that fact has caused the incentive to be improved while the crew availability catches up. I mentioned before issues and benefits about adjacent countries who are sort of acting together, or the benefits come along together. It also helps countries, even though they're not adjacent, smaller countries around Europe who have this kind of support, to be involved in projects with the bigger countries in the whole co-production, the whole co-production market. We talked about whether or not domestic productions are negatively affected by international portable productions coming in to displace them. There's no data that either proves or disproves this, although our consultations show that this should not be an issue. There are benefits for local production companies who are developing and producing national films. They can also get involved with some international projects. I think we have to acknowledge that production volume will fluctuate in all the countries we study for a variety of reasons, and we all know what they are. One thing we can say finally, if we could just go back to that, is that a platform of sustained incentives, not jumping in and out, is a very important element in achieving all of the benefits that we've mentioned before. Okay, apologies for running over, but thank you very much.
Just one information point, there was a TV camera filming at the beginning of this session. It was Russian television, and no worry, it will not be integrated in the next episode of War of Thrones. The study has demonstrated one of our major concerns, the observatory, is the lack of data, the lack of harmonized data allowing to make solid comparison. In a sense, one of the slides that probably some of you were waiting is to have a general summary of what are the direct investment or the direct funding by countries and the fiscal cost of fiscal incentives, to have a general overview of what are the film policy, but this is not possible, and we have to recognize that our consultants are not in a position to collect all these figures to provide a comprehensive overview because the data do not exist in a comparable.
Thank you, André. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I won't give you a comprehensive introduction to the French tax-based incentive system because it would be too long. But as André said, I'll focus on a recent study we've commissioned to know more about the impact, the economic and fiscal impact of our system of tax relief instruments on growth, jobs, and public finances. And as a public body responsible for the implementation of public policies related to the cinema and audiovisual sector, we feel, of course, it is a duty for us to evaluate on a regular basis the efficiency of our aid schemes, whether they be direct aid schemes or tax-based incentive systems. And I'm very grateful to the Olsberg team for the very comprehensive analysis you've done about the efficiency in this benchmark of tax-based incentive systems in Europe. It's very important for us to know more about what neighboring countries are doing, and we've now focused on what's the impact in France of our national system. First of all, just to remind you about why we decided at the beginning of in 2003 to establish a tax-based incentive system in France. Traditionally and historically, the CNC is more focused on direct aid schemes, whether they be automatic or selective aid schemes. And there were two main reasons why we decided to implement tax relief systems. The first one was growing international competition, and the second one was growing difficulties for producers to raise private funding for their projects, for their work, because of shrinking investments from TV channels, for example, and shortage of capital for audiovisual production firms. So there were two goals for us as a public body. We wanted, you said repatriate, we wanted to relocate production in France because we felt that there were growing production flows out of France, of French-based or French initiative projects. And we wanted to relocate production, and we also wanted to attract foreign investors in France to produce films or to shoot in France. So what were the goals? There were basically four goals for public authorities when the Parliament decided to set up tax relief systems. First of all, to encourage French and foreign production firms to shoot and keep the post-production work in France, develop the employment of technicians and workers, promote French technical industries and research and development, and promote cultural diversity by supporting first directed films and access to fragile work. I'm not sure this is the most recent presentation, so I'll have to improvise now. But anyway, these are slides that introduce you to the French system. of cinema tax incentives. So I won't get into detail, but if you have any question, please feel free to ask me. I'll tell you more about what are the threshold, the ceiling of a tax system, what are the beneficiaries, what is the scope of eligible production costs, what are the types of production that are eligible to our tax system. As the Olsberg team mentioned, we have 4 instruments. We have one that is dedicated for video gaming, we have one that is dedicated for foreign initiative films in order to attract shooting in France, and we have 2 systems, one for the cinema, one for the audiovisual sector, in order to promote production in France. For this presentation and for the presentation of the impact of our study, I'll focus on 2 instruments, not the 4 of them. I'll focus on the tax credit system for the cinema sector, and the other one is the so-called TRIP, the tax rebate for international production. That is a tax rebate for international initiative films that are being shot in France. How did we assess, this is some sort of a methodological approach, how did we assess the impact on the French economy? We had mainly 3 to 4 criteria in order to assess the impact, the economic and fiscal impact of our tax relief systems. First of all, the impact on relocation of film. Second of all, the impact on jobs. Third, the impact on inward investment, that is attracting foreign investment in France. And fourth, the impact on public finances. As mentioned by the Olsberg study, we feel that there were a positive impact on the relocation of film production in France. When the cinema tax incentive was created in 2003, 65% of shooting days were shot in France for French initiative or European initiative films. Now it's about 3/4 of shooting days. So there were a 10%, not a 10%, 10-point increase in the number of shooting days in France since the implementation of the tax, the tax incentive system for our national production. And there was a parallel drop in the number of shooting days abroad. This is not a regular drop, as you can see. There's overall about less than 800 days shot abroad that were diminished between in about 10 years. But as you can see, there's a variation from year to year. And for example, there was a drop between 2003 when the CTI, when our tax incentive system was created, from 2003 to 2006. Then there was an increase again till 2010, and then there was a relocation movement. We don't know if that's due to our tax incentive system, because of course we have to take into account the impact of the economic crisis in Europe also. What is also positive to notice is that we can say that there was a positive impact of our tax incentive system or tax-based incentive system on jobs as well as economic activity in France. So positive impact on both jobs and production level. What is interesting to notice is that there was the impact on job is bigger than on production and on production activity, which means that thanks to our tax-based incentive system, we've been able to enrich economic growth with employment. That's very important in France. As you all know, there's an unemployment issue that is quite big in France, so it's important to notice that public regulated instruments or public policy instruments can enrich economic growth with employment and jobs. So there was about 40% increase in jobs in the audiovisual sector from within 10 years, and a 25% increase in production. Now the trickiest part was to evaluate the impact for the state, for public finances. And we had to calculate the impact, the positive impact on public finances by taking into account employers as well as employee contribution to public finances. And they can be tax revenues or social charges, social revenues. So we took into account employer contributions to social security, income tax revenues generated by people employed in the audiovisual sector, corporation tax revenue, and of course VAT revenues. And the result is that for €1 of tax rebate or tax credit spent by the government, there was approximately less than 12 euros of expenses of activity in France in the cinema sector, and the state get back approximately more than 3 euros of tax and social revenues. So for €1 spent on a tax rebate system, the state gets at least 3 euros of tax and social revenues. These are figures from for 2013. Now, if I look at the second example or the second illustration I wanted to give you, the tax rebate for international productions. So the tax rebate that aims at attracting foreign shooting in France. It's for live action movies or even animated movies, so it's for both. The result was that we, between 2009, when the tax system for international production was created, between 2009 and 2013, approximately 70 to 72 works were being shot in France, and that amounted to 365 million euros of expenses in France. Who are the main beneficiaries? These are producers from the United States and the United Kingdom. You can see the figures on the slides. They gather, those two countries gather approximately three-quarters of the expenses and of the works that benefited from this tax credit system. And there were also 13 other countries that benefited from it. This is quite important because, as you know, we are keen on promoting cultural diversity. So it's interesting for us to notice that our system that aims at attracting foreign investment is not only aimed at Hollywood production or Hollywood initiatives. But there were also people from Turkey, from China, Japan, Taiwan, Australia that benefited from this system. And the impact on our main economic criteria, main economic factors, whether it be jobs, activities, expenses in France, or public finances, are also positive from our point of view. And as you can see, thanks to this TRIP initiative, thanks to this TRIP system, we estimate that the study that was commissioned estimates that approximately 11,500 jobs were created thanks to these expenses that were made in France, and there were foreign initiative expenses. And for the sole year of 2013, more than 3,500 jobs were created. The focus is now on animation feature film, because we have a strong industry that is quite attractive and that is also commissioned by foreign companies to produce films for them. And to sum it up, for €1 of TRIP, for €1 spent by the French government to attract foreign shooting in France, we get approximately €7 of expenses in the audiovisual sector, which amounts to, in the end, 2.7 euros of tax and social revenues for the state. And hadn't we have this TRIP system, we think most of these foreign initiative productions would have been made elsewhere. So that's very important for the state to know that it's quite attractive. I think I'm done. I won't get into too many details. Many thanks for your attention, and I think the panel will go on.
For example, I guess it's the only national film agency keeping track of the number of days, providing statistics on the number of days, which is in this context very important. Sonia, you are representing a country with a very recent fiscal incentive system. We have seen in the Olsberg presentation that 2013 was a very impressive year of development. Is the trend continuing?
Yeah, the trend is continuing. The trend is continuing. I'm just going to put two numbers together, and that is basically, we introduced it. The Film Act was amended in 2011, and the scheme started in 2012. So there were 9 productions in 2012 and 2013 combined, and the combined local spend for those 2 years was 11 million. And only, the announced spend for this year is 12.5 million. So you can see, it's really upwards trend, and we are going to expect more because there's a word of mouth, there's a stability of the scheme, there are good experiences. We have also a benefit of one really big and very important client, which is called Game of Thrones, which is continuing to come back to Croatia. They even filmed the second season for the first time in Croatia without tax incentives, but the tax incentives being introduced had helped us to bring them back and to increase their presence whilst they were filming. So from Dubrovnik, which was King's Landing, they've now gone to Split, and this year for the season 5 it was even Šibenik. But most of it, that's our biggest client. As we do not have studio facilities, we do not attract like a big American productions. We've concentrated on high-end television. Also the dig that relocated from Jerusalem, had to relocate from Jerusalem, came to film in Croatia. But it is mainly, I would say, like medium budget European productions and European co-productions that are coming. And sometimes those are the productions that combine selective and automatic funding or tax incentive funding in our countries. So yes, we can see, and as we are cash rebate, that also poses a bit of a problems, and that's for us, it's very, very important to track the data, because it is the biggest tool that we have to explain to the politicians that they should increase the reserved amount of funding. Cash rebate schemes are very easy to introduce because it is about political consensus, but also it is, you have a reserved part of money in the budget, and you have to really keep track of what is, because Jonathan said that they have this inbuilt weakness, as they do not go through the normal tax system where the income is, it's there. So it is why this study is very important. That's why we get the data. And there's one really good thing in being a small country, and everything goes through one center, one department, so we can monitor this. We also, of course, lack a bit of a data of what was before the introduction of the incentive scheme, not so much about the selective funding, but about the television funding.
Okay, thank you. Now we will have a comment from the representative of the professional organization. We'll be starting with Benoit. You are representing hundreds of producers. How do you perceive the world of fiscal incentive in Europe, but also outside of Europe?
Well, thank you, Andre. Perhaps let me give you, one general comment first. I think, it's very important to highlight that public support, and especially tax incentive programs, became increasingly essential and necessary in this very special period of time for European film and perhaps TV sector. What I mean, actually, is that we see that film producers in Europe are suffering as regard to private financing. In particular, with net decline of home entertainment window. And we saw actually, that this home entertainment window was key in terms of pre-financing, was also key regarding actually revenue streams, regarding the exploitation of the works. And actually, basically, the increase of online distribution windows at the moment did not manage to compensate the decline of home entertainment windows. So it's just to say, that tax incentive programs and other cultural funding have been actually, a major major support for our film sector in Europe. If you agree, I would say some words regarding what I heard, in particular from Jonathan. I think what is quite interesting is that this study, or this presentation, Jonathan, at this stage, seems to confirm what we have been actually promoting over the past years, including here in Brussels, is that tax incentive programs are instruments that strongly contribute to the structuring and the development of a film and TV sector in member states, obviously having decided to set this kind of instrument. I could list, and I think you did it, and the CNC did it, at least 4 areas where tax incentive programs have positive effects on jobs, on skills for local workforce, on development of infrastructures, my French speakers in English, and obviously return of investment on jobs. I would like, just to echo what the CNC study says, and perhaps, it was not exactly the figures, that were in your presentation. But it seems actually that the credit d'impôt between 2004 and 2012 has been a major factor actually contributing to an increase of employment of 38% as far as I remember. And it's quite obvious that it's, should I say, regretful that the pan-European study carried out a commission by the observatory could not be in a position actually, to provide figures at the European level. But the truth is that all the studies I've been reading, in particular outside Europe, shows actually basically the same, that the number of employees or jobs created by tax incentive programs are extremely impressive. On return on investment for public authorities, so this is basically, what is the amount generated when a state gives €1. I think, we had several, I went into your study, but I think, the figures you gave us are perhaps focused on some categories, and I think you aggregated all the figures. As far as I understand, actually, basically, for €1 in France, when you consider all the existing tax incentive programs, the return on investment is €3.5, as far as I remember. Yeah, for the cinema sector. I understand that what the CNC did is actually to focus on, revenues or spending generated with all suppliers of a production company shooting in France. And my question, and perhaps it will be fun, relate to, did CNC somehow have been trying to assess the induced effect of tax incentive, in particular regarding promotion of countries, of France, and impact on tourism? Just obviously one example. When I say impact on tourism, that means impact, on hotel, impact on airlines, impact on cultural facilities, and so on and so on. Just one example, and this is actually basically, perhaps outside tax incentive programs, but actually proving the huge value of film actually regarding tourism. The Stockholm business region made a study 2 years ago, as far as I remember, regarding what was the expected impact of having the girl with a dragon tattoo. That was basically one of the book of Millennium series, which had actually 2 cinematographic adaptations. One in Sweden, one from Sweden, one from the US. Both of these films were shot in Stockholm. And actually, the expected increase in terms of tourism was between 3 and 4% additional tourists for Stockholm, with an additional revenues of 50 million euros. So just a way to say that when we are observing, assessing tax incentives, it's obviously important to be in a position to assess the induced positive effect of these tax incentive programs for the economy and locally, the local economy. I will go very fast. The other impact also to the development of infrastructure and increased skills for workforce. I just would like to point out what you said, Jonathan, regarding the fact that you have been focusing on the fact, that when the film, when there are some productions from outside Europe, shoot in some member states in Europe, there is actually an advantage also for local independent producers. And it was, I think, and this is actually how my neighbors in Europe are perceiving actually, the trend. It's very important to highlight, that indeed there are some gain from overall sector infrastructure improvement. There are obviously, interest regarding the fact that you have, an increased skill workforce locally. I could also say that this has also other benefits, not only for film and TV sector, but also for all national creative industries. Because, one technician could be working on set of a film, but could tomorrow work, in theaters and so on. Just to tell you that this is clearly structuring economy, and this is structuring in instruments. Perhaps of interest to say that the study could, I don't know what will be in, but could recall which projects are eligible under which tax incentive programs. Because the presentation could give the impression that only non-European production are eligible for the tax incentive program. It is not true. Actually, it's accessible to non-European in most of the cases. European non-national, and also the domestic productions in most of the cases, perhaps except for 3 in France. Last word, just to stress what you already said, Jonathan. Your presentation recalls all the elements contributing to the final decision from producer regarding where the film will be shot. And indeed, actually, there are a myriad of elements. Availability of financial instruments, like tax incentive, is just, and I want to stress just one of them. One of the elements of importance, if not the most crucial one, is creative elements that are forming part, actually, of the decision-making regarding where we're going to shoot. Some stories, some artistic decision are those, actually, making the decision regarding where we will be shooting. And actually, just to come back to the girl with a dragon tattoo, Stockholm was an actor, basically, of this film. And this is a perfect example that for some and many, I would say, films, the place where you will be shooting will be crucial in the decision-making process, including, obviously, the availability of skilled staff, obviously. And as a last word, it is perhaps best of interest now to highlight that there are many projects shoot in the country of origin of the production and the director and all the creative contributors. Because actually shooting outside its country of origin generates several constraints. For instance, it requires extra administration, more pre-production activities, and other elements obviously are of importance. You can imagine that when you are shooting outside the country, well, the language concept will be obviously essential, and you know that you will have to deal with a vast variety of languages when you are shooting outside. Thank you.
Thank you, Benoit, for this variety of comments. A question to Pauline. You are representing the directors, and I suppose that the directors are supporting the producer in any kind of support to film policy who could improve the financial economic situation of the industry. But what about the perception of the impact on the creation itself?
Well, yes, of course. Well, from a film director's point of view, fiscal incentives in general are a very positive thing. There is no question about that. But beyond the economic and social impact of those schemes, our main criteria to evaluate them is actually their cultural impact on audiovisual creation, obviously. So we consider that, of course, by attracting non-EU productions and co-productions throughout Europe, the schemes, of course, provide very important things for a film director. They provide infrastructure, employment, a high degree of professionalism throughout Europe. And that's of course very important for them to have a good professional context to actually do their job. That's why some of our members are very keen on proposing to the governments to actually get those tax incentives and going to in the countries in Slovenia or in Cyprus, for example. We also consider that those incentives to co-production foster a kind of creative collaboration between directors and their crews and their screenwriters, which is very important things for them, because it actually touches to what they consider Europe should be, a place of creative collaboration and thriving creation that is not only focused on their national situation, and of course in a political context of national retrenchments that sometimes is very obvious to everyone. It's something that really matters to them. But we also consider that those incentives must foster, obviously, European creativity, because that's kind of their core activity. And I think everyone can agree that outsourcing creation would be very, very damaging for the cultural identity, both locally and the European cultural identity itself. So, of course, this increase of investment for audiovisual works nationally is a very important factor that we welcome. And the main thing in all this that we are very careful about is that we do not want to get in a situation when we have a kind of a standardization of the creative process, where those investments, wherever they come from, would lead us to write always the same stories, because that's what those new investors will be more interested in. What we want is that those incentives actually shower money on all kinds of film, a diversity of films, so that authors can actually be born locally, grow locally, and then reach out to the world from that careful environment that has been built for them. So, in a nutshell, we think that fiscal incentives, whatever shape or form they have, must be part of a comprehensive and consistent audiovisual policy, both at national and European level.
Thank you. From the point of view of the workers, we've seen that there are some data showing positive impact on employment from the statistical point of view. We do not have all the statistics necessary, but what exists show
positive impact, but statistics is not everything.
No, statistics are not is not everything, but I would like to continue where Pauline has ended and underline this, and I think the study showed this in the summary. Fiscal incentives are very important. Sometimes they're even a determining factor, but they won't do the job alone. You need to have certainty of investment for the long run, to invest in infrastructure, into skills, into job development. Also have the certainty for producers and for the investors that there is a holistic industry approach in a given country, and indeed in Europe in general. And that is the basis. So I don't think we can make a link immediately between fiscal incentives and job growth, although job growth definitely benefits from the fiscal incentives. Let's put it that way. Second thing I want to say is that when we talk about jobs and the growth of jobs, we need to underline that we are operating in a very fragile labor market, which is characterized, as the study, the presentation has shown this morning, by a high level of mobility, which is beneficial to cultural diversity and the exchange and the cultural collaboration, but also puts the people working on set and in post and pre-production in high demand on their availability in different places. Second, the fragility is also expressed through that it's not permanent jobs. So when statistics, and here we come back to statistics, when you say, oh, we have such much more growth in jobs, actually the question I would then ask the researcher is, do you mean equivalent of full-time employment jobs, or did you count how many more people were working throughout the year on different productions? I mean, that is a very important qualifying thing I want to say, but it doesn't take away from the fact that fiscal incentives are a very important tool, but only one tool in the mix, and we cannot underline enough, also being here in Brussels and being aware that people look at state aid with legitimately very critical eyes here, but to remind those people that it is not about one measure, it's the mix of measures, and to have a successful national and European film industry, you need to be very careful in how you adjust and make those the mix of those tools more efficient in the future.
We have 10 minutes, and I would suggest maybe to ask the people in the public if there are any questions to our consultants or to our panelists. Could you introduce yourself?
Good afternoon. By now, my name is Hans Klok, and I'm from Amsterdam. I'm very interested to hear all the analysis and the figures, especially supporting more support from the local governments into the film industry. What I haven't heard was the effect on European co-productions. Is there maybe anyone in the panel who could give any idea whether that is on the increase, or whether that's becoming more difficult because each country is fighting for its own share of the pie? I would personally, from my own experience in the film industry, the European co-productions, in my opinion, is a perfect vehicle to increase the qualitative aspects of European cinema.
You, Jonathan?
I think I'll answer that. As Croatia's representative in Euromage, and we've just celebrated 25th anniversary, so we think you know, as I can see, I've been in Euromarch for the last 6 years and seeing the numbers, the productions coming and the structure of financing. I think that the tax incentives are only helping because they open yet another line of financing, and you know, you can get to the level of the financing you, for example, need to go to Euromarch. So I don't think that it has adverse effect. I think that it contributes to collaboration in between European countries, in between producers, because producers and directors, they are the ones, you know. We are talking about the countries, but it is creative people who are co-productions in Europe. And to come back to Croatia, as I maybe mentioned, like, you know, yes, one big client, yes, it's HBO, but you know, Game of Thrones is mainly European-based production. Even the production company is based in the UK. But most of our incentives went to European co-production, either, you know, unofficial co-productions or official co-productions. So, you know, that's something that, you know, we were really keen to keep, and not so much, you know, go after like a big American investors, because I think, you know, we're a small country, we have to use our comparative benefits, and there are other, you know, we can't compete on a certain level with big players in the field, but you know, we can find our corner, and European co-productions. And we've also increased, and then as a combination, we've increased our selective funding for co-productions. So it's gone up, so it's a really healthy combination. And you know, of course, I'm always preaching co-productions and European co-productions, you can see that.
If I'm correct, in most of the country, it's possible to mix fiscal incentives and direct funding and
co-production. Yeah, there are no constraints, and from my perspective, answering your question, there's definite evidence that the introduction of an incentive or an enhancement has a beneficial effect on co-productions, mostly gained from conversations with people, because one would have to do is analyse the data on the amounts of financing coming from each country for every film that is a co-production, to make sure that we understand the impact of the selective funding and of the automatic funding.
Just one, figures vary from year to year. In France, we produce approximately 270 feature films per year, approximately 30%, so almost a third of them are co-produced with other countries, whether they be, most of them are European countries, of course, and neighboring countries, and others are non-European countries.
Is that on the increase, or is that?
No, it's been almost equivalent. But I wanted to mention one figure because we saw the increase of investment inflows in Belgium. We've got 30 co-productions between France and Belgium per year, and of course the tax incentive system in Belgium has helped reach the level of French-Belgium co-productions to that level, because Belgium is now our first co-production partner, not only because of the language affinity, but also because of the tax credit system. And I would agree with all the members of the panel, selective aid schemes are key to promoting truly artistic co-productions, which is our aim today. To the amount of what is said by the cinema communication, you know that we can have a slightly higher aid intensity for co-productions, so that producers can gather more public funding when they co-produce.
Thank you. My name is Leena Laaksonen, and I also want to thank you for this seminar. But I have one question. I really feel like a novice in this with this matter. But what is not clear for me is that are all these different kind of incentive schemes, are they automatic or not? Because as far as I kind of understood, tax credit is automatic. But what about rebate and tax shelter? Is it also automatic? That's something I'd like to know. Thank you.
Okay, the rebate and the tax credits are kind of automatic in as much as there's a set number of criteria and measures to determine what production expenditure qualifies. And if you're a producer planning to go to a country to make use of the rebate or the tax credit, and you plan your expenditure in accordance with the rules, you will know before you start spending that money exactly the amount of rebate that you will get back. The tax shelter is also relatively automatic, but there are many more steps that you have to put in place in order to access it, including, if you're a producer, working with another entity, a firm of specialist financiers who need to raise the money from the investors. Now, there may be some of these companies, these investment organisers, if you like, that already have access to a pool of investors, so that a producer's conversation with them, you can be pretty confident as a producer that you are going to get the investment coming in. But it's not quite the same, because there will be probably competing projects that are going for the same amount of investment money. So the tax credit and rebate structures are much more certain and much more transparent. What I would say is an element of uncertainty with rebates or tax credits is if there is a cap on the amount available for the system in every year. If there's a cap every year, then what tends to happen is producers are encouraged to put in their applications early during the year, sometimes when they don't actually have everything together. And an application can go in some countries, can be preliminarily approved, but then when it comes to actually deciding is this going to happen or not, if the project doesn't happen, then the system gets confused, if you like. So the existence of a cap, and I understand politically why it might be there in some countries, actually can be quite a harmful impediment to a smooth and efficient operating of a system.
The Sofica system in France is a selective dimension.
Most of our tax-based incentive systems are automatic, but we have two. The one dedicated to video gaming, because there's a cultural test for it, and the Sofica system, which is some sort of a tax shelter system that channels private investment in films in return for tax rebate on income tax and the income tax. The financial instruments that are set up by corporations that are incorporated in France, they have to meet certain criteria in order to have access to the to the Sofica system, tax rebate system. And these criteria are that they have to have a certain amount of investment in low-budget films or first to second feature films. They have to invest almost all of their money in independent or independently produced films. So these are the so-called cultural diversity criteria.
That's exactly one of the main things that we're very concerned about, because I'm sure everybody is aware of the situation that arose in French-speaking Belgium with the tax shelter, and some of those effects that they had to focus on big commercial productions, which actually had our Belgian member be very forceful about the fact that reform was needed alongside the whole industry.
We are maybe now time to discuss on the adverse effects of tax shelter or fiscal incentives in general, because we have a general impression that it's positive, but there are some risks, mainly if there is no precise evaluation year after year.
First, it's very difficult actually, to anticipate what will be the effect of tax incentive next years. I think, some countries, have implemented some tax incentive initiative with France, with Sofica, and some others are certainly able now to identify what could be the effect of such instruments. This is basically the same regarding other kinds of public support, including for training, including for support of script writing and so on. So just way to say that you have to wait some years before being in a position actually to identify. I would like to say one word because Jonathan actually emphasized what has been happening in some countries. From our point of view, actually, tax incentives are a kind of dual instrument. Obviously, cultural instruments, but having a very strong economic purpose. At the same time, these instruments are coexisting with, let's say, cultural fundings. This is actually basically selective and automatic, which goal is to be in a position for the states to have a local cinematography able to speak about what's going on in the country with local languages and so on. I would like to highlight, that obviously there is a risk if some member states or countries were actually at some point considering to say, well, we have to put a top priority on tax incentive and forget cultural fundings. Because basically it works because they are both, and not only one. So just want to highlight and to recall the value that this is a strategy for film and television sectors. That's something you could have asked. And it was basically actually, inside the presentation we saw, we have to anticipate the future needs. Johannes said so. We have to anticipate, states have to anticipate what will be the needs in terms of employees. How can we set up training and so on, so on, so on. That's the same regarding infrastructures. We are talking about studios, but we can also talk about promotion agency. We can also talk about several other categories actually, this is a strategy. And if you fail to have this strategy, at some point there will be some adverse effect, but not perhaps only on tax incentive programs, but because some thoughts have not been considered by public authorities, but also by private sector. I would like to say that the responsibility is only on member states.
Okay, Jonathan, I think it will be your last word of the conclusion. What is your view on this point, and with all the interview you made, with all the literature you went through, do you think that member states are working enough to prevent these adverse effects? And what would be your recommendations?
Well, yeah, I think, first of all, adverse effects. Yes, if this kind of fiscal incentive is not part of a holistic, strategic, all-of-sector strategy in a country that anticipates what the effects of the incentive might be, that helps the incentive, leverage other kind of support. So, on their own, not particularly helpful. And indeed, we've had situations, and this takes me to my second point, which is predictability. We've had situations like in the UK in 2006, where the tax shelter incentive was probably not fully understood by the government at the time, where there were some significant adverse effects because it was badly structured. And the government, to the shock and surprise of anybody, closed the door and stopped it immediately. That was disastrous. So for an incentive such as this to be a success, it A, has to be part of a holistic strategy, and B, it has to be predictable, reliable, consistent, and to give everyone the confidence that it's there. But you asked me, what can be done to deal with any adverse effects. I honestly don't think that there are that many adverse effects, and I did touch on a few of them. And I sort of go back to a point you made very earlier, and that's about transparency. So that's about having, in all the countries in Europe that have incentives, a consistent, comparable way of gathering data about that and about the effect of incentives and what's going on with incentives. So it will become much easier in the future to do the kind of study that we did. That's quite a challenge, obviously, and I would suggest baby steps first, but that would be the solution to dealing with any perceived problems.
Okay, thank you. I think it's time to conclude, Susanna.
First, I want to thank all of you for having come, for having stayed, for having participated. A special thank to our panelists and to our consultants. And I want to pick up one last word from Benoit. He was talking about anticipating needs and strategies. Now, we anticipated the need that you might want to continue to discuss among yourself, and that you will be very hungry at this point in time. And our strategy, therefore, is to invite you to a little finger food, so with cutlery, I hope. And please continue to enjoy this event, and thanks again for having me with us.